He looked her over critically, and observed with brotherly candour, "What a quiz of a hat!" "It is an Angoulême bonnet, and the height of fashion," retorted Nell with spirit. "And as for quizzes, Di, I never saw you look so odd as you do in those yellow pantaloons."
"Devilish, ain't they?" agreed his lordship. "Corney made me buy 'em. Said they were all a crack."
"Well, if I were you, I wouldn't listen to him."
"Oh, I don't know. Always up to the knocker is Corney. If you ain't in a scrape, why do you want my advice?"
She gave his arm a warning pinch, and began to talk of indifferent subjects in a careless way, which, as he informed her upon their arrival in Grosvenor Square, made him wish that he had not chosen to walk down Bond Street that morning.
"Because you can't bamboozle me into believing you ain't in a scrape," he said. "I thought you were looking haggard, but I set it down to that bonnet."
Nell, who had led him upstairs to her frivolous boudoir, cast off her maligned headgear, saying wretchedly, "I am in a dreadful scrape, and if you won't help me, Di, I can't think what I shall do."
"Lord," said the Viscount, slightly dismayed. "Now don't get into a fuss, Nell. Of course I'll help you. Least I will if I can, though I'm dashed if I see. However, I dare say it's all a bag of moonshine."
"It isn't," she said, so tragically that he began to feel seriously alarmed. She twisted her fingers together and managed to say, though with considerable difficulty, "Dysart, have you got the £300 I gave you?"
"Do you want it back?" he demanded.
She nodded, her eyes fixed anxiously on his face.
"Now we are in the basket," said his lordship.
Her heart sank. "I am so very sorry to be obliged to ask you."
"My dear girl, I'd give it you this instant if I had it," he assured her. "What is it? Gaming debt? You've been playing deep, Nell?"
No. It is a court dress of Chantilly lace, and I cannot tell Cardross."
"What, you don't mean to say he's turned out to be a screw?" exclaimed the Viscount.
"No, he has been crushingly generous to me, only I was so stupid, and it seemed as if I had so much money that... Well, I never took the least heed, Di, and the end of it was that I got quite shockingly into debt."
"Good God, there's no need to fall into flat despair if that's all," said the Viscount, relieved. "You've only to tell him how it came about. I dare say he won't be astonished, for he must know you haven't been in the way of handling the blunt. You'll very likely come in for a thundering scold, but he'll settle your debts all right and regular."
She sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "He did settle them?"
"Eh?"
ejaculated Dysart, startled. "I had better explain it to you," said Nell. It could not have been said that the explanation, which was both halting and elusive, very much helped Dysart to a complete understanding of the situation, but he did gather from it that the affair was far more serious than he had at first supposed. He was quite intelligent enough to guess that the whole had not been divulged to him, but since he had no desire to plunge into deep matrimonial waters, he did not press his sister for further enlightenment. Clearly, her marriage was not running as smoothly as he had supposed, and if that were so, he could appreciate her reluctance to disclose the existence of yet another debt to Cardross. "What am I to do?" Nell asked. "Can you think of a way, Di?"
"Nothing easier," responded Dysart in a hardening tone. "The trouble with you is that you ain't up to snuff yet. The thing to do is to order another dress from this Madame Thing."
"Order another?" gasped Nell.
"That's it," he nodded.
"But then I should be even deeper in debt."
"Yes, but it'll stave her off for a while."
"And when she presses me to pay for that, I buy yet another? Di, you must be mad."
"But, dear girl, it's always done."
"Not by me," she declared. "I should never know a moment's peace. Only think what would happen if Cardross discovered it."
"There is that, of course," he admitted. He took a turn about the room, frowning over the problem. The deuce is in it that I am not in good odour with the cents per cent. I'd raise the wind for you in a trice if the sharks didn't know dashed well how our affairs stand."
"Money-lenders?" she asked. "I did think of that, only I don't know how to set about borrowing. Do you know, Di? Will you tell me?" The Viscount was not a young man whose conscience was overburdened with scruples, but he did not hesitate to veto this suggestion.
"No, I will not," he said.
"I know one shouldn't borrow from money-lenders, but in such a case as this, and if you went with me, Di—"
"A pretty fellow I should be," he interrupted indignantly. "Damn it, I ain't a saint, but I ain't such a loose screw that I'd hand my sister over to one of those bloodsuckers."
"Is it so very bad? I didn't know," she said. "Of course I won't go to a money-lender if you say I must not."
"Well, I do say it. What's more, if you did so, and Cardross discovered it, there would be the devil to pay. You'd a deal better screw up your courage and tell him the whole now." She shook her head, flushing. "You know, it queers me to know what you've been doing," said Dysart severely. "Sounds to me as though you've had a quarrel with him and set up his back. It ain't my business, but I call it a cork-brained thing to do."
"I haven't... It isn't that," she stammered.
"You must have done something," he insisted. "I thought he doted on you."
Her eyes lifted quickly to his face. "Did you, Di? Did you indeed think so?"
"Of course I did. Well, good God, what would anyone think when he no sooner clapped eyes on you than nothing would do for him but to pop the question? Lord, it was one of the on D of town. Old Cooling told me no one had ever seen him sent to grass before, no matter who set a cap at him. Thought myself he must be touched in his upper works," said the Viscount candidly. "I don't say you ain't a pretty girl, but what there is in you to make a fellow like Cardross marry into our family, I'm dashed if I can see."
"Oh, Dysart," breathed Nell, trembling, You're not roasting me?" He stared at her.
"Have you got windmills in the head, too?" he demanded. "Why the devil should he have offered for you if he hadn't been head over ears in love with you? You aren't going to tell me you didn't know you'd given him a leveller?"
"Oh, don't say such things. I did think at first, but Mamma told me, explained to me how it was."
"Well, how was it?" said the Viscount impatiently.
A marriage of convenience," faltered Nell. "He was obliged to marry someone, and he liked me better than the other ladies he was acquainted with, and thought I should suit."
"If that isn't Mamma all over!" exclaimed Dysart. "It was a dashed convenient marriage for us, but if he thought it was convenient to be obliged to pay through the nose for you, which I don't mind telling you my father made him do, let alone saddling himself with a set of dirty dishes who've been under the hatches for years, he must be a regular cod's head."
"Dysart!" she cried, quite horrified.
"Dirty dishes," he repeated firmly. "I can't remember when my father last had a feather to fly with, and the Lord knows I've never had one myself. In fact, it's my belief we should have been turned up by now if you hadn't happened to hit Cardross's fancy. It's the only stroke of good fortune that ever came in our way."
I knew he had made a handsome settlement."
Dysart gave a crack of laughter. "Aye, and towed my father out of the River Tig into the bargain."
She sprang up, pressing her hands to her hot cheeks. "Oh, and I have been so wickedly extravagant."
"No need to fret and fume over that," replied Dysart cheerfully. "They say his fortune knocks golden balls into flinders, and I shouldn't be surprised if it was true."
"As though that should excuse my running into debt. Oh, Di, this quite overpowers me. No wonder he said that."
He looked uneasily at her. "Said what?" "If you mean to have a fit of the vapours, Nell, I'm off, and so I warn you."
"Oh, no, indeed I don't. Only it is such an agitating reflection. I didn't tell you, Di, but he said something to me which made me think he believes I married him for the sake of his fortune."
"Well, you did, didn't you?"
"No," she cried hotly. "Never, never."
"What? You don't mean to tell me you fell in love with him?" said the Viscount, incredulously.
"Of course I did. How could I help but do so?"
"Of all the silly starts," said his lordship, disgustedly. "What the devil should cast you into this distempered freak if that's the way of it? What have you been doing to make Cardross think you don't love him if you do?"
She turned away her face. I was trying to be a conformable wife, Di. You see, Mamma warned me about not making demands, or hanging upon him, or appearing to notice it if he should have another interest. And,
"Oh, so the blame lies at Mamma's door, does it? I might have known it. Never knew such a hen-witted creature in my life."
"Oh, Dysart, hush. Indeed, she meant it for the best. You will not repeat it, but she was so anxious I shouldn't suffer a mortifying disillusionment as I am afraid she did."
"Did she, though?" said the Viscount, interested. "Didn't know my father was pitching it rum in those days. I must say I should have thought even Mamma could have seen that Cardross ain't a bird of that feather. Never been a man of the town from anything I ever heard. How came you to swallow all that humdudgeon, Nell? Dash it, you must have known he was in love with you."
I thought it was all consideration, because he is so very kind and gentlemanlike," she confessed.
"Kind and gentlemanlike," repeated Dysart, in accents of withering scorn. "Well, upon my soul, Nell, seems to me you're as big a ninny hammer as Mamma. To be taken in by one of her Banbury tales when there was Cardross making a regular cake of himself over you, if that don't beat the Dutch."
She hung her head, but said in a faint voice, "It was stupid of me, but there was more than that, Di. You see, I knew about Lady Orsett. Letty told me."
"That girl," said the Viscount severely, "wants conduct. Not but what I shouldn't have thought you needed telling, because everyone knew she was his share of me for years. And don't put on any die-away airs to me, my girl, because for one thing, it's no use bamming me you didn't know anything about my father's light frigates, and for another, Cardross's way of life before you married him ain't your concern. Lady Orsett's got Lydney in tow now, so that's enough flim-flam about her."
"Has she, Di?" Nell said eagerly.
"So they say. I don't know."
"Oh, if it were not for this dreadful debt, how happy I should be," she sighed.
"Nonsense. Make a clean breast of the whole to Cardross and be done with it."
"I'd rather die. Don't you understand, Di? How could he believe me sincere if I told him now, when I am in debt again, that I didn't care a button for his fortune?"
The Viscount checked the scoffing retort that sprang to his tongue. He did understand. After a thoughtful moment, he said, "He'd think it was cream pot, love, wouldn't he? Aye, very true, bound to. Particularly," he added in a voice of censure, "if you've been treating him with the stupid sort of indifference which I've a strong notion you have. Oh, well, we shall have to think of some way of raising the blunt, and that's all there is to it."
Too grateful for his willingness to come to her aid, to cavil at his freely worded criticisms, Nell waited hopefully, confident that he would be able to tell her how to extricate herself from her difficulty. Nor was she mistaken. After a turn or two about the room, he said suddenly, "Nothing easier. Can't think why I didn't hit upon it at once. You must sell some of your jewellery, of course." Her hand went instinctively to her throat. "The pearls Mamma gave me, her very own pearls, I could not, Dysart."
"No need to sell them if you don't care to. Something else."
"But I haven't anything else," she objected. "Nothing of value, I mean." "Haven't anything else?
Why, I never see you but what you're wearing something worth a king's ransom. What about all those sapphires?"
"Dysart, Giles's wedding gift," she uttered.
"Oh, very well. But he's always giving you some new trinket. You must be able to spare one or two of 'em. He'll never notice. Or if you think he might, you can have 'em copied. I'll attend to that for you."
"No, thank you, Di," she said, with desperate firmness. "I won't do anything so odiously shabby. To sell the jewels Giles has given me, to have them copied in paste so that he shouldn't know of it. Oh, how detestable I should be to deceive him in such a way."
"Well, what a high flight," said Dysart. "No worse than going to a cent per cent. In fact, it ain't as bad."
"It seems worse," she assured him.
"I tell you what it is, Nell," he said, exasperated. "If you let this excessive sensibility of yours rule you, there will be no way of helping you out of this fix. If you don't care to have your trinkets copied, tell Cardus you lost 'em. I dare say you would not like to lose the sapphires, but you aren't going to tell me your heart would break for every one of the trinkets he's given you."
"No, indeed it would not, if I really did lose them. But every feeling revolts from the thought of selling them for such a reason." She spoke with so much resolution that it seemed useless to persist in argument. The Viscount, never one to waste his time over lost causes, abandoned his promising scheme, merely remarking that of all the troublesome goosecaps he had encountered, his sister bore away the palm. She apologized for being so provoking, adding, with an attempt at a smile, that he must not tease himself any more over the business. But every now and then the Viscount's conscience, in a manner as disconcerting to himself as to his critics, cast a barrier in the way of his careless hedonism. It intervened now, just as he was congratulating himself on being well out of a tiresome imbroglio.
"Very pretty talking, when you know deuced well I can't help but tease myself over it," he said bitterly. "If there's one thing more certain than another, it's that if I hadn't borrowed the 300 from you, you wouldn't be in this fix now. Well, there's nothing for it. I shall have to get you out of it. I dare say I shall hit on a way when I've had time to think it over, but I shan't do it with you sitting there staring at me as though I was your whole dependence. Puts me out. And there's no saying, of course, but what I may have a run of luck, in which case the matter's as good as settled. I've got a notion I ought to give up hazard, and try how it will answer if I stick to faro." He then took his leave, bestowing an encouraging pat on his sister, and recommending her to put the whole business out of her mind. There were those who would have taken the cynical view that he would speedily put it out of his, but Nell was not of their number. It did not so much as cross her mind that her dear Di, either from indolence or forgetfulness, might leave her to her fate. And she was quite right. There was an odd streak of obstinacy in Dysart, which led him, at unexpected moments, to pursue with dogged tenacity the end he had in view. And although his intimates considered that this streak was roused only by the most cork-brained notions, they were agreed that once such a notion had taken firm possession of his mind, he could be depended on to stick to it buckle and thong. Emerging from the house after a genial discussion with his brother-in-law's porter on the chances of several horses in a forthcoming race, he paused at the foot of the steps, considering whether he should summon a hackney and take a look in at Tattersall's, or stroll to Conduit Street, where, at Limmer's, he would be sure to encounter a few choice spirits. While he hesitated, a tilbury, drawn by a high-stepping bay, swept round the angle of the square, and he saw that the down-the-road-looking man in the tall hat and the box coat of white drab who was handling the ribbons with such admirable skill was Cardross. He had no particular desire to meet the Earl, with whom he knew himself to be no favourite, but he waited civilly for the tilbury to draw up beside him. "Hello, Dysart,"
said the Earl, handing the reins over to his groom and jumping down from the carriage.
"You just going in or just coming out?"
"Just coming out," replied Dysart, watching the tilbury being driven away.
"It's a nice tit you have there. Looks to be a sweet goer. Welsh?" Yes, I'm pretty well pleased with him, agreed Cardross. Very free and fast, and has a good knee action. Oh, yes, purebred Welsh. I bought him from Chesterford last week. You care to come in again? No, I'm bound for Limmer's, said the Viscount. He eyed his brother-in-law speculatively. The Earl appeared to be in an amiable frame of mind. It was common knowledge that he was rich enough to be able to buy an abbey, and if there was the least chance of getting £300 out of him merely for the asking, the Viscount was not the man to let this slip. "You wouldn't care to lend me 300, would you?" he suggested hopefully. 300. "Call it 5, offered the Viscount, recollecting certain of his own more pressing obligations. Cardross laughed. "I'll call it anything you choose, but I shouldn't at all care to lend you money, and I'll thank you, Dysart, not to apply to Nell." "Nothing of the sort," said the Viscount, repressing a strong inclination to tell him that the boot was on quite the other leg. "Dipped again?" inquired Cardross. "You ought to be tied, you know." "I see no sense in that," returned Dysart. "Wouldn't do me a bit of good. The only way to come about is to make a big coup. I don't doubt I'll do it, for it stands to reason the luck must change one day. However, I've been thinking seriously of devoting myself to Pharaoh, and I believe I'll do it. The devil's in the bones, and has been this year past." The news that he was about to reform his way of life met with a disappointing lack of enthusiasm. "What other entertainments have you in store for us?" asked Cardross. "I didn't see you driving a wheelbarrow blindfold down Piccadilly last week, but I'm told you contrived to dislocate all the traffic for a considerable space of time. I must congratulate you. Also on your latest feat of cutting your initials on all the trees in St. James's Park." "An hour and 15 minutes," said Dysart, with simple pride. "Very creditable." "Oh, Lord," Dysart said petulantly, "what else is there to do but kick up a lark now and then?" "You might see what can be done to put your estates in order." "I ain't my estates," retorted Dysart. "I fancy I see my father letting me meddle. What's more, if there's anything to be done, old Moulton will do it far better than I could. He's been our agent for years, and he don't mean to let me meddle either. Not that I want to, for I don't." "I'll make you an offer," said Cardross, scanning him not unkindly. "I won't lend you 300 to fling away at Pharaoh, but I'm prepared to settle your debts, and to buy you a commission in any serving regiment you choose to name." "By Jove, I wish you would," Dysart said impulsively. "I will." The Viscount's blue eyes had kindled, but that eager glow faded, and he laughed, giving his head a rueful shake. "No use. The old gentleman wouldn't hear of it. God knows why he's so set on keeping me in England, for putting aside the fact that I'm not his only son, don't seem to be any pleasure to him to have me at home. Fidgets him to death. I did go down to Devonshire after he had that stroke, you know. Went to oblige my mother, but the end of it was she was obliged to own it didn't answer. But he wouldn't let me join for all that." "If you wanted it, I might be able to persuade him." "Grease him in the fist, eh? Take my advice and fund your money, or wait till I do something so outrageous he'll be glad to see me off to Spain on any terms," said Dysart, pulling on his gloves. "Don't be a fool. Come into the house. We can't discuss it in the road." "If you're so anxious to waste the ready, let me a monkey," mocked Dysart. "As for the rest, oh, Lord, I don't know what I want, and it wouldn't be a particle of use if I did." He waited for a moment, and then, as Cardross made no reply, laughed rather jeeringly, and strode off down the flagway. Chapter 4. It was almost with relief that Nell, a few days later, bade her husband a polite farewell. When he had asked her to accompany him to Merion,
she had wanted very much to do so, though not with an indignant Letty in her train. But from the moment that Madame Laval's bill had arrived to blacken her life, she had dreaded that he might renew his persuasions. There was now nothing she wanted less than to be in his company, for the sense of guilt, which already weighed heavily on her spirits, almost crushed her when he was with her. If he smiled at her, she felt herself to be a deceiving wretch. If there was a coolness in his manner, she fancied he had found her out, and was ready to sink. It did not occur to her, in this disordered state of mind, that the scruples which forbade her to let him see her heart were prompting her to pursue a course that might have been expressly designed to confirm him in his suspicion that she cared for nothing but wealth, fashion, and frivolity. There was no lack of parties at the height of the season to fill her days, and no lack of eager escorts for the beautiful young countess if the Earl had engagements of his own. It seemed to him that he never saw her except on her way to a review or a ball, and he could scarcely doubt that she preferred the company of even the most callow of her admirers to his. "You know, my love," he said to her once, mocking himself, "I think fate must have thrown me in your way to depress my pretensions. Would you believe it? I was used to think myself the devil of a fellow, and now perceive that I am no such thing. Almost a dead boar, in fact." She had not answered him, but the colour had flooded her cheeks, and as her eyes flew to his for a brief instant, he thought that he caught a glimpse of the loving, vital creature he had once believed her to be. And a moment later she was gone, saying, with a nervous laugh, that he was absurd, that Letty was waiting for her, that she must not stay, because she had promised faithfully to attend Lady Brixworth's al fresco party out at Richmond. Subjected to such treatment as this, it was hardly surprising that Cardross, far too proud to betray his hurt, retired behind a barrier of cool, faintly ironic civility, which effectually slew at birth Nell's impulse to fling caution to the winds, and all her doubts and difficulties at his feet. To make matters worse, no word came from Dysart, and Letty, bent on achieving her own ends, wore her brother's temper thin by renewing her attacks every time she saw him. As she had been pledging his credit all over town for weeks past, he was soon provoked into addressing a few shattering home truths to her, from which his unhappy wife, an unwilling third at this encounter, gathered that debt and dishonesty were, in his austere view, synonymous terms. Certainly no moment for the disclosure of her own embarrassments could be more unpropitious. It was therefore with relief that she bade him farewell. He expected to be away for a serennight, within which time she thought it not unreasonable to suppose that Dysart must have discovered a means of discharging her debt to Madame Laval. By way of recalling it to his mind, just in case, in the press of his sporting engagements, he had temporarily forgotten its urgency, she sent round a note to his lodging in Duke Street, inviting him to dine in Grosvenor Square on the night of the masquerade. Well aware of the fatal results of importunacy, she resisted a temptation to ask him what progress he had made towards settling her affairs, and was soon rewarded for her restraint. The Viscount not only sent back a note accepting her invitation, but added in a postscript that she need not trouble her head more over that other matter. This cryptic message sent her spirits up immediately. It would have been more satisfactory, perhaps, if Dysart had told her what expedient he had hit upon, but she knew him to be no ready letter-writer, and was content to trust that his third attempt at solving her difficulties would be more acceptable to her than his two previous suggestions. Except for one encounter in the park, where it was impossible to hold private conversation with him, she did not meet him. a circumstance which led her to suppose that whatever plan he had evolved needed a good deal of preparation. This made her feel a trifle uneasy, but he nodded to her so reassuringly at the end of their one chance meeting that her misgivings were soothed. "I shall see you on Thursday," he said. And that, she thought, was his way of informing her that on Thursday, when he was to go with her to the masquerade, he would be able to tell her just what she must do to rid herself of her intolerable debt. And then on Thursday evening, when both the fair hostesses awaited his arrival in Grosvenor Square, he did not come. Neither was surprised that he should be late in keeping his engagement, for his habits were known to be erratic, and for a full half-hour only the wizard below stairs, with 2 capons roasted to a turn on the spits, fat livers in cases in imminent danger of becoming overbaked in the oven, and the caramel sugar spun over a dish of peu d'amour rapidly hardening, saw any cause for agitation. Letty, who had been in low spirits for days past, was wearing a new and extremely dashing ball dress of white crepe so profusely embroidered with silver spangles that when she stood in the light of the great chandelier in the drawing-room, the effect was quite dazzling. Nell, less strikingly attired in satin and blonde lace, knew that if Lady Chudley should be at the masquerade, she would unhesitatingly condemn this toilette as being totally unsuited to a young lady in her first season, for it was cut indecorously low, besides being worn over the most diaphanous of petticoats. Cardross would probably have insisted on its being changed for something more demure. He might even have considered that in his absence his wife should have done so, but Nell felt herself to be unequal to an exhausting and almost certainly losing battle, and assuaged her conscience with the reflection that the dress would be largely hidden by the domino of shimmering rose silk which Letty had tossed across the back of a chair. Besides, Letty was so pleased with her appearance that it had put her into the sunniest of humours, which Nell, having endured a week of sulks and repinings, would not willingly upset. "The worst of brothers is that they never think it is of the least consequence to keep one waiting," remarked Letty, spreading open a fan spangled to match her gown. "I only hope he may not be foxed when he does arrive. Look, do you think this is pretty?" "Foxed? Why should he be?" demanded Nell, rather indignantly. "Oh, you know what men are when they go off to watch a cock-fight," said the worldly wise Letty. "There was one at Epsom today, I fancy." "Good heavens! Did he tell you he meant to go there?" "No, but I heard Hardwick talking to Mr. Bottersham about it, and he said something about Dysart's taking him up in his curricle." "Oh, dear," said Nell, considerably dismayed by this most unwelcome intelligence. "If that is so, oh, I do hope he may not have forgotten he is to take us to Chiswick tonight." "What, you don't mean to say that you think he might?" exclaimed Letty, allowing her fan to drop into her lap. "Oh, it would be too infamous." Certain sinister memories flitted through Nell's mind. "Well, I trust he has not, but he does sometimes forget his engagements, particularly when he doesn't like them excessively," she said. Letty controlled herself with a strong effort, but when, at the end of another 10 minutes, there was still no sign of the Viscount, she could contain herself no longer, but said bitterly, "Even if he is your brother, Nell, I don't believe he ever meant to go with us, and he just said he would so that you shouldn't tease him." No, he did mean to, for he said he would see me tonight when we met him in the park that day. Besides, although I own he is shockingly careless, he wouldn't serve me such an unhandsome trick as that. I was wondering if I should perhaps send a note round to his lodging to remind him. Only I dare say it would take my footman at least 20 minutes to reach Duke Street. Yes, and 10 to 1 he wouldn't find him at home when he did reach his lodging," interrupted Letty. "For my part, I don't care a button whether he comes or not, for I am persuaded we shall do very well without him." She looked at Nell with sharp suspicion. "You're not going to say we can't go to the masquerade unless he escorts us?" "Oh, Nell, you couldn't be so shabby." "No, that is, I know I need not scruple to go when it is to my cousin's party, but I cannot like it. I wish you were not so set on it, and to own the truth, I can't think why you should be. Unless you have cajoled Mr. Allendale to go, and mean to spend the evening in his pocket, and mask or no mask, Letty, I can't and I won't permit it." "I did try to make him go," admitted Letty, quite unabashed, "but he holds to it that it would be improper, even if he slipped away before the unmasking, so you needn't be in a fidget. The thing is that I have never attended a masquerade, and if I don't go to this one, I may not have the chance to go to one for years, for there's no saying that they have them in Brazil after all." Nell looked at her in concern. "No, but, dearest Letty, don't indulge your fancy with that thought. Cardross won't give his consent. It is useless to think he might." "I shall compel him," Letty said, looking mulish. "How could you possibly do that?" "Well, I don't know that yet, but you may depend upon it that I shall do it. Recollect that he said I shouldn't be presented until I was 18, or act in the theatricals at Roxwell at Christmas, or drive his bays, or 100 things. I can always get Giles to let me have my own way in the end." Nell could not help smiling at the naivete with which Letty classed these trivialities with her marriage. But before she could make any attempt to show her sister-in-law how the very fondness which led Cardross to indulge her in small matters would stiffen his resolve not to permit her, as he thought, to throw herself away in a marriage doomed to failure, Farley, her butler, had entered the room, bearing on a salver a sealed billet, and on his countenance the expression of one who not only brought evil tidings, but had foreseen from the outset that this was precisely how it would be. "My Lord Dysart's groom, my lady, has desired me to give this instantly into your ladyship's hands," he announced, proffering the salver. "Only wait until I next see Dysart," uttered Letty direfully. Feeling as conscience-stricken as though she and not Dysart had been the culprit, Nell broke the wafer that sealed his note and hastily unfolded the scrawled message. A sigh of relief escaped her, for although the news the message contained was bad, it was not as bad as it might have been. Dysart must certainly have lingered over long at Epsom, but he had not forgotten that he was engaged to escort his sister to a masquerade. He begged her pardon for being unable to dine with her, but promised faithfully to pick her and Letty up in Grosvenor Square not a moment later than 10 o'clock, unless, in a postscript, he should be unavoidably detained, in which case they were to set forward for Chiswick, and might be sure that he would meet them there, his mask in his hand. 10 o'clock, and we are invited for 9:30, said Letty wrathfully, when this was read to her. A gleam of mischief shone in Nell's angelic eyes. "My dear, surely you would not be so Gothic as to arrive at the very start of the party?" "I dare say he won't come here at all," said Letty crossly. This seemed more than likely to Dysart's experienced sister, but loyalty, as much as disinclination to drive out to Chiswick without male escort, hardened her resolution not to order her landau to come round to the house a moment earlier than 10 o'clock. The hour was by this time so far advanced that they had not very long to wait after dinner before Farley announced that the carriage waited for their ladyships. Dysart had put in no appearance, and although a loving sister would have given him a few more moments' grace, she dared not, in face of Letty's kindling glance, suggest this. The dominoes, one rose-pink and the other sapphire blue, were assumed. Long gloves of French kid drawn on, blue masks tucked into reticules, and evening mantles carefully donned over the silken dominoes. A final prinking on tiptoe before the gilded looking-glass over the mantelpiece, and the ladies were ready to be escorted down the staircase and handed up into the waiting carriage. Their respective women were in attendance, jealously arranging their delicate skirts and laying shawls across their knees. Letty's Martha presuming on long service to warn her young mistress against adding any more bloom of Ninon to an already perfect complexion, and Nell's lofty dresser reminding her to take care that her train of ivory satin did not brush the steps of the landau when she alighted from it. Those steps were at last let up, and the door shut. The footman nimbly mounted up behind, the coachman set his horses in motion, and the landau swayed forward over the cobbles. It had not occurred to Nell, or indeed to any of her servants, that a drive to Chiswick could be attended by danger, so no one had thought it necessary to provide the equipage with any outriders to protect her from possible highwaymen. But no one had foreseen that the Cardross carriage, instead of joining a procession of vehicles bound for Brent House, would be the last to arrive there by more than half an hour. There was hardly any traffic beyond the first pike off the stones. Kensington village seemed to be sleeping in the bright moonlight. Only a post-chaise and an accommodation coach were met in Hammersmith, coming in from the west. No other vehicle was seen except one of the mails, which swept past the Cardross carriage, its 4 fresh horses going along at a spanking pace, and its guard blowing a very loud blast of warning on his yard of tin. Shortly after this, the carriage turned off the high road towards Chiswick Mall, and then, just as Letty was saying, "Well, at all events, it hasn't been nearly as tedious a drive as if we had been obliged to dawdle behind some rumbling coach," both ladies were unpleasantly startled by a sudden pistol-shot, followed by a medley of alarming noises, in which the squeal of a frightened horse mingled with various rough voices upraised either in command or expostulation, and the trampling of hoofs. Letty uttered a whimper of fright, and clutched her sister-in-law, saying on a rising note of panic, "What must we do? What will happen to us? Oh, no, we are being held up. Why don't those cowards of footmen do something? This is all Dysart's fault. Will they murder us? Oh, I wish we hadn't come." Nell was not feeling very brave herself, but she was made of sterner stuff than this, and managed to reply with very creditable command over her voice, "Nonsense! Of course they will not murder us, though I am afraid they will take our jewels. Thank God I am not wearing the Cardross necklace or my precious sapphires." "Give them everything," begged Letty, her teeth chattering. "I feel sick with apprehension, and I am sure I shall faint. What is the use of taking footmen when they do nothing to protect us? I shall tell Giles, and he will turn them off directly. He ought to be here. He had no right to go off to Merion when he might have known—" "Oh, do pray hold your tongue, Letty," interrupted Nell, exasperated. "I wonder you should not have more pride than to let the wretches see you are afraid. And as for the footmen, what could the poor men do against armed ruffians? They are not carrying pistols. I don't suppose they ever dreamed we should be held up on the road to Chiswick, of all places. Oh, dear, it sounds as if there were several of them. I do hope they will be satisfied with our jewels, and not wish to ransack the carriage for a strong box." This horrid thought made Letty shake with terror. Then she screamed, for a hideous figure, enveloped in a dark cloak and with a mask covering his face, loomed up and wrenched open the door of the carriage, presenting the barrel of a large horse-pistol, and growling in ferocious accents, "Hand over the bugles, and be quick about it." The moonlight glinted on the pistol, and the hand that held it. Letty cried, "Don't, don't," and tried with feverish haste to unclasp the single row of pearls from round her throat. "Not you," said the highwayman, even more ferociously. "You." The pistol was now pointing straight at Nell, but instead of shrinking away, or making haste, as Letty quaveringly implored her to do, to strip off her bracelets and rings, and the large pendant that flashed on her breast, she was sitting bolt upright, her incredulous gaze fixed at first on the hand that grasped the pistol, and then lifting to the masked face.
"Quick!" commanded the highwayman harshly. "If you don't want me to put a bullet through you."
"Dysart! Hell and the devil confound it!" ejaculated his lordship, adding, however, in a hasty attempt to cover this lapse,
"None of that! Hand over the gewgaws!"
"Take that pistol away," ordered Nell. "How dare you try to frighten me like this? Of all the outrageous things to do, it's a great deal too bad of you. What in the world possessed you?"
"Well, if you can't tell that, you must be a bigger sapskull than I knew," said his lordship disgustedly. He pulled off his mask and called over his shoulder, "Bubbles, Corny!" "There, what did I tell you?" said Mr. Fancourt, putting up the weapon with which he had been covering the coachman, and riding up to bow politely to the occupants of the carriage. "You ought to have let me do the trick, dear boy. I said her ladyship would recognize you." "Well, I don't know how the devil she should," said the Viscount, considerably put out.
"Oh, Di, how absurd you are!" Nell exclaimed, trying not to laugh. "The moonlight was shining on the ring Mamma gave you when you came of age. And then you said, 'Not you,' to Letty. Of course I recognized you."
"Then you might have had the wit to pretend you didn't," said the Viscount with asperity. "Totty-headed, that's what you are, my girl. Hi, Joe, no need to keep those fellows covered any longer. I've lost the bet."
"Dysart, how abominable of you," Nell said indignantly. "To bring your groom into this is utterly beyond the line."
"Fiddle," said the Viscount. "You might as well say it was beyond the line to bring Corny in. I've known Joe all my life. Besides, I told him it was for a wager."
"I do say it was beyond the line to bring Mr. Fancourt in, and I should have supposed he would have thought so too," added Nell, with some severity.
No, assure you, Mum, always happy to be of service," said Mr. Fancourt gallantly. "Pleasure."
Letty, to whom relief had brought its inevitable sequel, said in a furious undervoice,
"Idiot!" "Are you the sort?" said the Viscount, overhearing. "In fact, if we're to talk of idiots—"
"I think you are detestable. You broke your engagement with Nell in the rudest way, just that you might play this odious trick on her, and frightened us to death for sport. Sport!"
"What a hen-hearted girl you are," remarked his lordship scornfully. "Frightened you to death, indeed. Lord, Nell's worth a dozen of you. Not but what she's got more hair than wit. Of course I didn't do it for sport. I had a devilish good reason. But one might as well try to milk a pigeon as set about helping a female out of a fix."
Etty was so much intrigued by this cryptic utterance that her wrath gave place to the liveliest curiosity. "What can you mean? Who is in a fix? Is it Nell? But how? Oh, do tell me. I'm sorry I was cross, but how could I guess it was a plot when no one told me?"
"Ask Nell," recommended Dysart. "You'd best be on your way if you don't wish to be late. I'll follow you presently."
"Dysart," said Nell despairingly, "it must be nearly 11 o'clock already. How can you possibly follow us? You cannot attend a masquerade in your riding dress, and by the time you have returned to town and—"
"Now don't fly into a fidget," begged Dysart. "I am not going all the way back to London. You must think I'm a gudgeon."
"Oh, I do," she interpolated, on a quiver of laughter.
"Well, that's where you're fair and far off," he told her severely. "I've got all my toggery waiting for me at the Golden Lion here, and a chaise hired to bring me on to Brent House. Yes, and when I think that I never planned anything so carefully in my life, only to have it overset because nothing would do for you but to show how clever you are by screeching that you knew me, I have a dashed good mind to wash my hands of the whole business." "Good God, dear boy, mustn't say things like that," intervened Mr. Fancourt, considerably shocked. "I know you didn't mean it, but if anyone else heard you—" "Well, there isn't anyone else to hear me," said the Viscount snappishly, walking away to where his groom was holding his horse. Mr. Fancourt, feeling that it behoved him to make his excuses for him, pressed up to the carriage and bowed again to its dimly seen occupants, saying confidentially, "You don't mean what he says when he gets in a miff. No need to tell you so. I know Di, you know Di. You won't buckle." "Mr. Fancourt," said Nell, almost overcome by mortification, "I am persuaded I have no need to beg you not to tell anyone why Dysart tried to hold me up tonight." "I shouldn't dream of it," Mr. Fancourt assured her earnestly. "Wild horses wouldn't drag it out of me. Well, stands to reason they couldn't, because, now I come to think of it, I don't know." "You don't know?" she repeated incredulously. "I forgot to ask him," he explained. "Well, mean to say, no business of mine. Di said, 'Come up and help me to hold up my sister's carriage,' and I said, 'Done,' or some such thing. Nothing else I could say. Dashed inquisitive to be asking him why, you know." At this moment Dysart called impatiently to him, so he made his bow and went off. Nell sank back into her corner of the carriage, exclaiming, "Thank heavens! I was ready to sink." She became aware of her footman awaiting orders, and said hastily, "Tell James to drive on, if you please. His lordship was just funny." "I should think he must believe his lordship to be out of his mind," observed Letty, as the carriage moved forward. "Why did he do it, Nell?" "Oh, for a nonsensical reason." "Very likely. But what nonsensical reason?" "I wish you would take a leaf out of that absurd Fancourt's book and not ask inquisitive questions." "I dare say you do, but I shan't. Come now, you sly thing." "No, pray don't tease me," Nell begged. "Oh, very well. I wonder what Giles will say to it," said Letty, all sprightly innocence. "Letty, you wouldn't." "Not if I were in your confidence, of course," replied Letty piously. "Really, you are the most unscrupulous girl," declared Nell. Letty giggled. "No, I'm not, for I never betray secrets. I shan't rest until I know this one, I warn you, for I cannot conceive what was in Dysart's head, unless he was just knocking up a lark, and that I know he was not." "Well, pray don't think too badly of him," Nell said, capitulating. But Letty, listening entranced to Nell's story, did not think at all badly of Dysart. She said handsomely that he had far more wit than she had ever guessed, and was much inclined to join him in blaming Nell for not having held her peace. For if only you had pretended not to recognize him, everything would now be in a fair way to being settled, and you can't deny that if you had truly not known him, you wouldn't have cared a button for your jewels. I suppose you might have guessed how it was when he brought you the money, but that wouldn't have signified." "How can you say so? My peace would have been utterly cut up. I must have told Cardross. Yet how might I have done so when he already thinks Di too rackety? Oh, it would have been worse than anything." "I declare you are the oddest creature," Letty said. "For my part, I think you should have sold some of your jewels, and I don't wonder at it that Dysart is out of all patience with you. I suppose you may do what you choose with what is your own." She continued arguing in this strain until Brent House was reached, and when Dysart presently joined his sister in something very like a fit of the sullens, did much to restore him to good humour by heartily applauding his ingenuity, commiserating him on the mischance which had brought his scheme to nothing, and abusing Nell for having such stupid crotchets. For once they found themselves much in sympathy. But when the Viscount said that if Nell made such a piece of work over a little necessary deception, she had better screw up her courage and tell Cardross she was under the hatches again, agreement was at an end between them.
Letty strongly opposed this suggestion. In her experience, Cardross, in general so indulgent, was abominably severe if he considered one had been extravagant, and if confronted by debts, however inescapable, he became positively brutal. She spoke with feeling, her last encounter with her exasperated brother still vivid in her mind. "Only because I purchased a dressing-case, which every lady must have, and desired him in the civilest way to pay for it, for how could I do so myself on the paltry sum he allows me for pin-money? He sent it back to the shop. I was never so mortified, and would you credit it, Dysart? He promised me that if I again ran into debt, he would send me down to Merrion in charge of a strict governess. A governess!" The Viscount was not much impressed, and indeed he would have been still less impressed had he been privileged to set eyes on the necessary adjunct to a lady's comfort in question. A handsome piece of baggage, that dressing-case, with every one of its numerous cut-glass bottles fitted with gold caps, embellished with a tasteful design in diamond chips. It had made the second footman, a stout youth, sweat only to carry it up one pair of stairs, and when it was flung open it had quite dazzled the eyes of all beholders. It had dazzled Cardross's eyes so much that he had closed them, an expression on his face of real anguish. "That has nothing to say to anything. I dare say he thought it not the thing for you," said the Viscount with unconscious shrewdness. "But everyone knows court dresses cost the deuce of a lot of money, and I shouldn't wonder at it if—" "When Giles discovered that Nell was so monstrously in the wind, he said such things as cast her into the greatest affliction." "Were you there?" demanded the Viscount suspiciously. "No, I was not there, but I saw her directly afterwards, and she was quite overset. She cried in the most affecting way, and ever since she has been subject to fits of sad dejection. If you abandon her, it will be the most abominable thing I ever heard of." "Who said I meant to do so?" retorted his lordship. "All I said was. But it ain't to the purpose. It's a pity tonight's affair came to nothing, but I shall come about. And I'll thank you not to start meddling," he added in a very ungallant way. "I have not the remotest intention of meddling," said Letty, rigid with wrath. "Well, see you don't," recommended Dysart. "And don't go blabbing either." These ungentlemanly words brought to an abrupt end the excellent understanding which had seemed to be flourishing between them. Letty, in freezing accents, requested his lordship to restore her to her chaperon, and his lordship did so with unflattering alacrity. Finding that Nell was attended by a great many of her friends, he did not feel that it behoved him to remain at her side, but went off to amuse himself in his own way. Since he was, regrettably, one of those dashing blades who could not be trusted to keep the line at a masquerade, he managed to do this tolerably well by flirting outrageously with any lady obliging enough to encourage him. By the time that had palled, he had been so fortunate as to have rubbed against a crony, in whose company, and that of several other barks of the first head, he spent the remainder of the evening, rejoining his sister finally in very merry pin. He was not precisely cast away, as he would himself have phrased it, and only a high stickler could have found anything to object to in the affable, not to say rollicking, mood engendered by the champagne punch. But it was evident that he had temporarily banished care, and could not be expected to bend his mind to the solving of Nell's difficulties. Instead, he entertained the ladies during the drive back to town with snatches of song, delivered in a fine, forceful baritone. Chapter 5. In spite of the absence from it of Mr. Allendale, Letty had much enjoyed the masquerade. Like the Viscount, she had indulged in a good deal of flirtation, allowing her vivacity to carry her to lengths only possible under the disguise of a mask and domino. She had received a great many audacious compliments, and her spangled gown had been much admired. Her giddiness added nothing to Nell's comfort, but she was powerless to check the liveliness that several times put her to the blush. A gentle admonition was met merely with a laugh and a toss of the head, and when she ventured to say, "Letty, if you won't keep a proper distance for your own sake, do so for mine, I beg of you," her wilful sister-in-law replied, "Oh, fudge! You place yourself on too high a form. There's no harm in romping a trifle at a masquerade. Everyone does so. It's all just fun and gig." "It is unbecoming," Nell said. "Bath, Miss Manners. You wouldn't behave with so little particularity if Mr. Allendale were here?" "Dear Jeremy, no, indeed. I should flirt with him instead. But he is not here, and I have no notion of being moped and die away at such an agreeable party, I can tell you. I think we are having a splendid night's raking, don't you?" It was useless to persist. Useless, too, to hope that Letty would not be recognized. At midnight there would be a general unmasking, when disapproving eyes would see that the fast girl in the shimmering domino and the spangled gown was none other than Cardross's little half-sister. Youth and a naturally volatile disposition led Letty, carried away by excitement, into behaviour that was beyond the line of being pleasing. The evils of her former situation in her aunt's house were never more clearly shown. She had neither precept nor example to guide her, her aunt being both indolent and shatter-brained, and her cousins over-bold young women with nothing in their heads but finery and dalliance. Having perceived Lady Chudley amongst the gathering of unmasked chaperons, Nell braced herself to meet the inevitable strictures which she did not doubt her husband's most formidable aunt would feel it her duty to address to her. In the event, however, Lady Chudley was surprisingly gracious. She certainly condemned the spangled dress, and was thankful that she had no cause to blush for her own daughter, but she said that she did not blame Nell for Letty's want of conduct. "It is much to be regretted that Laetitia does not take a lesson from you, my dear Helen," she said majestically. "I shall not deny that I have been used to think that Cardross made a great mistake when he chose to offer for you. I always speak my mind, and I told him at the time that he would do better to ally himself to a female nearer in age to himself. But I must own, and do not hesitate to do so, that I have been agreeably surprised in you. It is a sad pity that Laetitia has neither your discretion nor your taste." With these measured words of approval she moved on, which was just as well, since Nell could think of nothing whatsoever to say in reply to them. Her daughter, a rather angular girl, unkindly described by her cousin Felix as an antidote, lingered to exclaim, "Only fancy Mamma saying that to you! She doesn't often praise people, I can tell you, Cousin Helen." The congratulatory tone in which this was uttered was a little too much for Nell. She said tartly, "I am sure I ought to be very much obliged to her." "I knew you must feel it so. Do you know, she said to me yesterday that you were a very pretty-behaved young woman. There!" "Did she, indeed? Well, don't repeat any more of her compliments, for they might puff me up too much in my own conceit." Miss Chudley tittered. "That's precisely what Mamma said. At least, I mean, she said it was a wonder that your head was not turned by all the compliments you received. But I quite expected her to censure you for permitting Letty to wear such an improper gown. I can't think how she can do so without blushing. I could not.
No, and I must own that I think you would be very unwise to attempt anything in the same style, instantly retorted the pretty-behaved Lady Cardross. But Letty, you know, has so perfect a figure that she can carry off anything. For my part, I never saw her in greater beauty. And I hope she told her detestable mother, Nell said, when later recounting this exchange to Letty.
Well, said Letty, giggling, what about, sir? When you took one look at my dress and said you had never seen anything so improper.
Yes, but I didn't say it was not becoming. And in any event, it was a great piece of impertinence for Miriam to criticize you, or for Lady Chudley to do so either, for now I come to think of it, she is not your aunt, but only Giles's.
Dear Nell,
gurgled Letty. Nell submitted to an enthusiastic embrace, but said, in rather a conscience-stricken tone, "But I must tell you, Letty, that I agreed with every word they said. It is a shocking dress. And don't say you didn't damp your petticoat, for I know you did. Nothing else would have made it cling so. What Cardross must have said had he seen it.
You sound just like a governess."
"So I do," Nell said, much struck and looking quite aghast. "What an odious girl you are, Letty, to put me to that necessity. You make me feel like a governess." "I did not purchase a lace gown for more than 300 guineas, said Letty, folding her hands and gazing piously at the ceiling. "I am not in a quake lest my husband should discover it." Quite confounded, poor Nell remained speechless for several moments. She made a gallant recover. "No, you bought a dressing-case for £500, didn't you? And you are not in debt because Cardross sent it back. At least that has not happened to me." "I hoped you wouldn't remember that," said Letty candidly.
"Oh, Nell, it has put a famous notion into my head. Send the gown back to Laval. You may say that it is not in the least what you wanted, and doesn't become you."
"Well, if that is your famous notion, I never heard anything so unscrupulous in my life," gasped Nell. "Besides, I tore it a little at Carlton House that night, and Laval would instantly see where Sutton darned it." "What a pity!" "There is nothing for it, then, but to order another dress from the horrid creature," said Letty, unconsciously echoing Dysart. "That is what my aunt does when her dressmaker duns her. And if you keep on sending it back, saying it does not fit, or that you prefer a floss trimming instead of lace or some such thing, it won't be finished until the quarter, and then you may pay for both gowns. Why, in less than 2 months it will be quarter day, and you will find yourself in funds again. I see no difficulty." The suggestion found no favour with Nell. But since Madame Laval had followed up her bill with a polite letter, drawing my lady's attention to it, and trusting that my lady would find it convenient to defray it within the immediate future, she felt her case to be desperate, and resolved on a course which, disagreeable though it might be, seemed to hold out more promise of success than any scheme Dysart was likely to evolve. She would pay Madame Laval a visit, not to bespeak another expensive dress, but to explain with what dignity she could muster that although it was not at all convenient to her to pay the account in the immediate future, she would faithfully do so at the end of the following month. That this would dig an uncomfortably large hole in her next quarter's allowance, Nell realized, but decided, with the optimism of youth, that with a little economy she would contrive to scrape through the summer months. She had been startled to receive Madame's letter, and shrewd enough to perceive, underlying its smooth civility, a threat. But she was as yet too inexperienced to know that some unusual circumstance must lurk behind it,
or that no modiste of high fashion would dream, for the paltry sum of 330 guineas, of alienating a patroness of such rich promise as the young Countess of Cardross. But after a very few minutes in Madame Laval's company, she learned that the circumstances governing Madame's action were very unusual indeed. Madame, after a long and lucrative career in Bruton Street, was about to retire from business. She was, in fact, returning to her native land, but this she naturally did not disclose to Lady Cardross, preferring to say, with a vagueness at odd variance with her sharp-featured face, with its calculating slow eyes and inflexible mouth, that she would henceforward be out of the way of collecting debts. Lady Cardross was certainly an innocente, but even a bride from the schoolroom might wonder how it would be possible for Madame to return to France in time of war. It was possible, if one had money and time to spend on the journey, influential connections to assist one over the obstacles in the path, and above all, relations well placed in Paris. From England one might still travel to Denmark, and after that, eh bien, the matter arranged itself. On the whole, Madame had done very well out of her last London season, but this was now in full swing. Her most valued clients had purchased quite as many gowns as they were likely to need, and it was time to close her accounts. She had several bad debts, that went without saying. It was not worth the pain of attempting to recover those losses, but she knew well that although Lady Cardross might be at a temporary standstill, her lord was as wealthy a man as might be found, and would certainly pay his wife's debts. The sense of this she managed to convey to Nell in the most urbane manner conceivable, not an ungenteel word spoken, the sugared smile never deserting her lips. "Oh, if it is the case that you are retiring from business," said Nell, shrugging her shoulders with splendid indifference, "I had not perfectly understood. Naturally you will wish to be paid immediately. Rest assured that I will attend to the matter." She then sailed away, her head high, and her heart cowering in her little kid shoes. Madame, having curtsied her off the premises with the greatest deference, rubbed her hands together and said, "She will contrive, that one." That she must somehow contrive, and without Cardross's knowledge, was by this time a fixed determination in Nell's mind. Every day that had passed since the first appearance of Madame's account had added to her dread that he would discover the debt. Reason was lost sight of. The debt, and Cardross's sentiments, if he should be called upon to pay it, assumed grotesque proportions, until it seemed to her as though it might wreck her life. No sobering counsel was at hand to cast a damper on lurid imagination and give her thoughts a saner direction. Letty, exaggerating her own experiences, recommended her at all costs to settle the matter before Cardross got wind of it, and Dysart, knowing how much his own depredations on her purse were responsible for her present predicament, was apparently prepared to go to extraordinary lengths for the furtherance of this end. But Dysart had shaken her faith in him. Letty might applaud his scheme for her relief. She could not. It seemed to her a shocking thing to have attempted, and the thought of what next his wild humour might prompt him to do put her in a quake of apprehension. There must be no depending on Dysart, and there was no one else to whom she could turn. Such a reflection as this was scarcely soothing to nerves already irritated. The conviction that she was friendless, and hunted into the bargain, began to take strong possession of Nell's mind. She sank into a slough of self-pity, seeing her debt as a sum large enough to have ruined a nabob, and her husband as a miser with a heart of flint. It was in this mood that she presently stepped down from her barouche, and it was her coachman who rescued her from it by desiring to know whether she would be requiring the carriage again that day. The very mention of it dispelled that unjust vision of Cardross. Just because she had once admired a friend's barouche, he had given her one for her very own, and with a pair of horses that took the shine out of every other pair to be seen in town. She had not liked the famous Cardross necklace, an awe-inspiring collection of emeralds and diamonds heavily set in gold, and instead of being offended, he had told her to keep it for state occasions, and had given her the most charming pendant to wear in its stead. For everyday use, he had said, with the smile that had won her heart in his eyes. Self-pity turned in an instant to self-blame. From being a tyrannical miser, Cardross became the most generous man alive, and quite the most ill-used, and she the embodiment of selfishness, extravagance, and ingratitude. And if Dysart were to be believed, she had added blindness and stupidity to these vices. It now seemed to her wonderful that Cardross should have remained patient for so long. Perhaps he was regretting the impulse that had made him offer for her, perhaps even disgust at her coldness and depravity had already driven him back to Lady Orsett. A year earlier, Nell, instructed by Mamma, had steeled herself to accept the fact of Lady Orsett as one of the inescapable crosses a wife must bear with complacence. But between the girl who had supposed herself to be making a marriage of convenience and the bride who had been brought to realize that hers was a love match, there was a vast difference. Mamma would scarcely have recognized her docile, beautifully mannered daughter in the bright-eyed young woman who uttered between clenched teeth, "She shan't have him." This determination, excellent though it might be, only strengthened her resolve to settle Madame Laval's account without applying to Cardross. In her view, nothing could more surely jeopardize her whole future than to cast out lures to her husband while presenting him with yet another debt. He must certainly believe her to be hoaxing him, playing off a detestable cajolery that could only disgust a man of sensibility. Her thoughts flickered to the second of Dysart's suggestions, that she should sell some of her jewellery. Not, of course, Cardross's gifts, but perhaps the row of pearls Mamma had given her. But every feeling revolted. They were Mamma's own pearls, jealously preserved by her for her eldest daughter, and bestowed upon her with such affecting tenderness. Stress of circumstances had obliged poor Mamma to sell nearly all her jewellery, but her pearls she had clung on to through the direst of her straits, and for her daughter to sell them only to pay for an extravagant gown must sink her forever below reproach. A very little reflection convinced Nell that there was only one way in which she could raise £300. It must be borrowed. Dysart had rather unexpectedly condemned this expedient, but Nell knew that even Mamma had had dealings with a moneylender, so that borrowing upon interest, though it might be an expensive practice, could not be a crime. Papa, of course, had carried it to unwise lengths. Nell perfectly understood how ruinous continued borrowings could be, but it was surely absurd to suppose that anything very dreadful would happen if one borrowed £300 only for a few weeks. It would be paid back at the end of June, and no one need ever know anything about it. The more she considered it, the more Nell liked the scheme, and the more she was inclined to attribute Dysart's severe attitude to some antiquated notion of propriety. Even the most careless of brothers could be amazingly stuffy on any question of conduct affecting the ladies of his family. That was one of the most incomprehensible things about men. To hear Papa in the bosom of his family, one would suppose that modesty and discretion were the two virtues he considered most indispensable in a female. But there had been nothing in Papa's career to suggest this, indeed far otherwise. Dysart, warmly approving the generously displayed charms of a certain actress, almost in the same breath, could speak censoriously of his sister's gown if it were cut rather lower than usual, or clung too closely to her form for his suddenly austere taste. Even Cardross suffered from this peculiarity. He had not criticized her raiment, but he made no secret of the fact that he expected from his wife and sister a degree of decorum which he did not practice himself. "I will have no scandal in my household," said Cardross inflexibly, just as though he had not been creating scandal in Lord Dorset's household for years. Nell didn't doubt that he would disapprove strongly of his wife's patronizing a moneylender, but she didn't allow it to worry her very much. Imprudent it might be, but what Mamma had done could not be a crime. Nell gave Dysart a day's grace, and when he neither came to see her nor wrote to tell her what he next meant to do, set forth, not without some inward trepidation, on a visit to Mr. King in Clarges Street. It had been Mr. King who had enjoyed Mamma's custom. There were certain difficulties in the way of setting forth from Grosvenor Square alone and on foot, but she overcame these by ordering her carriage round to take her to the Green Park, where, she said, she was going to walk with some friends. At the last moment Letty nearly spoilt this careful plan by going with her, but she had the happy thought of saying that she had arranged to meet in the park two ladies whom Letty violently disliked. So Letty decided instead to go with her maid on a shopping expedition. Nell might tell herself that there was no harm in her projected errand, but she could not tell herself that it would be proper to take Letty into her confidence, for, oddly enough, although it might be allowable for herself to seek relief from her difficulties with Mr. King, for Letty to do the same thing would be quite shocking. And she could not help feeling that that was just what Letty would do, once the idea had been put into her head, for she was never out of debt, and had lately been warned by Cardross that he was not going to encourage her extravagant habits by continuing to defray all the totally unnecessary expenses she incurred. Nell dressed herself with great care for her expedition, choosing from the formidable collection of walking dresses in her wardrobe one of cambric, made high to the neck and with long sleeves, and only a border of cable trimming to relieve its austerity. For some reason which she could not have explained, she felt that when one visited a moneylender, one's habit should be as modest as possible. So she added a sarcenet pelisse of dark blue to her ensemble. This lent her an undeniable note of sobriety. But when it came to the selection of a hat, the only one she possessed that approached sobriety was made of olive-brown silk. No exigency could induce her to wear this with a blue pelisse, so she was obliged to choose instead a frivolous bonnet that matched the pelisse, but was trimmed with lace and flowers. A thick veil served a double purpose of providing a disguise and a touch of rather dowdy respectability. It also staggered her dresser, and certainly made her suspicious, but Nell said glibly that the dust from the streets had slightly roughened her cheeks, an explanation which seemed to satisfy Miss Sutton. Set down at the Bath gate, Nell entered the Green Park, and strolled for a little while beside the basin, trying to recruit her ebbing courage. Two unwelcome thoughts had occurred to her. Mamma, when she had turned in desperation to Mr. King, had employed a go-between, and would not Mr. King wish to know her identity? She had not previously considered this possibility, but as she rehearsed, during the drive from Grosvenor Square, what she must say at the coming interview, she realized that not the most obliging moneylender was in the least likely to advance a large sum of money to an unknown and heavily veiled lady. Not only would he wish to know what were the circumstances of his client, but no doubt he would demand a note of hand from her. One might, of course, sign this with a fictitious name, but that would hardly satisfy Mr. King. Nell was quite shrewd enough to know that an obscure Mrs. Smith of no address would find it very much harder to borrow money upon interest than would the wife of an extremely wealthy peer. A good deal daunted, it was with lagging steps that she left the park and crossed the ruts and cobbles of Piccadilly. Her errand no longer seemed so innocuous, for while it would be a simple matter, and surely quite unembarrassing, to arrange a loan under a cloak of anonymity, it was another matter altogether to be obliged to announce, "I am Lady Cardross." She turned into Clarges Street, and was soon abreast of the discreet-looking house in which Mr. King carried on his business. She hesitated, saw that a man on the opposite side of the street was looking at her, and walked on, blushing under her veil. When she ventured to look round, he had disappeared from her view, so she turned and began to walk back. By this time she was wishing herself 100 miles away, dreading what lay before her, no longer sustained by the comforting reflection that it was not so very wrong after all. A small but insistent inner voice told her that on this occasion Mamma would not wish her example to be copied, and again she walked past Mr. King's house. From a window in a house on the other side of the street, Mr. Hethersett had for several minutes been observing these vacillations through his quizzing-glass. The particular crony whom he had come to visit, having addressed several remarks to him without receiving any other answer than an absent-minded grunt, at last demanded if anything was amiss, and came to see what was claiming his attention. Mr. Hethersett, letting his glass fall on the end of its ribbon, ejaculated, "Good God!" and hastily picked up his hat and gloves. "Can't stay," he said. "Remembered something important." His astonished friend protested, but Mr. Hethersett, in general polite to a point, did not stay to listen. He was out of the house in a matter of seconds and crossing the street with long strides. Nell, drawing a resolute breath, had mounted the first of the steps leading to Mr. King's front door, when she heard herself accosted in slightly breathless accents. "Cousin?" said Mr. Hethersett. She jumped and looked round. Mr. Hethersett raised the hat from his head and executed the bow for which he was famous. "Very happy to have met you," he said. "Beg you will allow me to escort you home." "Sir?" uttered Nell, in what she hoped was the outraged voice of a stranger. Apparently it was not. "Can't hope to deceive me in that bonnet," explained Mr. Hethersett apologetically. "Wore it the day I drove you to the Botanic Gardens." Acutely aware of the goggling gaze fixed on him from a window across the street, he added, "Take my arm. George Burnley has his eye on us, and it won't do for him to recognize you. Not that I think he will, but no sense in running the risk." "I am very much obliged to you, but pray don't stay for me," Nell said, trying to speak in a careless way. I have some business to transact." "Yes, I know. That's why I came across the road." "You know?" she repeated, rather scared. "But you cannot know, Felix. Besides—" "What I mean is, know whose house this is," he explained. "It ain't any concern of mine, but it won't do for you to be doing business with Duke King, cousin. What's more, if Cardross knew—" "You won't tell Cardross," she cried involuntarily. He was just about to refute with considerable indignation the suggestion that he was a tale-bearer, when Prudence intervened. He temporized. "I won't tell him if you let me escort you home. If you don't, nothing else for me to do." "Felix, I never thought you could be so ungentlemanly." "No," he agreed. "To tell you the truth, I didn't either. But the thing is, would be a dashed sight more ungentlemanly to go off and leave you to get into a pickle. Duke King? Lord, cousin, do you know the fellow owns an ornamental villa on the river? Slab up to the nines. Never saw such a place in your life." "No, "And I don't see what that has to say to anything," retorted Nell crossly.
"Point is, where did he find the blunt to pay for it? From people like you, cousin. Take my word for it."
Yes, but I only wish for a loan for a particular reason, just a very temporary one." He drew her hand through his arm and obliged her to walk with him up the street.
"Believe me, fatal," he said earnestly.
She sighed, but attempted no further argument. After a pause, Mr. Hethersett coughed and said delicately,
"Very reluctant to offend you. Awkward sort of business. Thing is, might be able to be of service. Tolerably plump in the pocket, you know."
She was a good deal touched, but said at once, "No, indeed. I am sure there was never anyone half as kind as you, Felix, but that would be the outside of enough. And you mustn't suppose that I am in the habit of borrowing money. There are reasons why I don't wish to apply to Cardross for this particular sum. Don't let us talk about it. It is of no moment after all."
"Certainly not. Wouldn't dream of prying into your affairs, cousin," he replied. "Only wish to say, at least I don't, but must, feel myself obliged to ask you to give me your word you won't come running back here as soon as my back's turned."
She sighed, but said submissively, "No, I won't do that, if you think it is so very bad."
"Worst thing in the world," he assured her.
"I don't see why it should be. After all—"
"You may not see why, but it ain't a bit of use telling me you didn't know it because I've been watching you," said Mr. Hethersett severely, "going backwards and forwards like a cat on a hot-baked stone."
"Oh, how can you say such an uncivil thing?" she protested. "I did not."
"That's what it looked like to me," he said, with great firmness. "Not the moment for civility, either. Got a great regard for your cousin. Dashed fond of Giles, too. Wouldn't wish to see either of you in a tangle. Thing is, nothing he wouldn't give you. A vicious thing to do, giving you advice. But if you're in a fix, you tell him, not you King."
She said unhappily, "There are circumstances which— Oh, I can't explain it to you, but he mustn't know of this." To her relief, he forbore to press her. She would have been dismayed, however, had she known the construction he had put on her words. Mr. Hethersett, who had so strongly disapproved of his cousin's alliance with any member of Lord Pevensy's family, had now the doubtful felicity of realizing how just had been his objections to the marriage. If Nell had incurred a debt she dared not disclose to Cardross, it was as plain as a pikestaff that she had embroiled herself in her brother's chaotic affairs. In Mr. Hetherssett's view, that was almost the only form of expenditure Cardross would not tolerate in his wife. Probably he would not take gaming debts in good part either, but Mr. Hethersett did not think that Nell was a gamester. He had once struggled to support her through several rubbers of whist, an experience which had left him in doubt of her ability to distinguish spades from clubs. He had made his offer to rescue her from embarrassments in good faith, but he was considerably relieved by her instant refusal of it. He enjoyed a considerable independence, but the last settling day at Tattersall's had not been happy, and to have advanced what he feared must be a very large sum of money to Nell must have left him in uncomfortably straitened circumstances. It might also, if the truth leaked out, have involved him in a quarrel with Cardross, who would certainly feel that he had behaved in a very improper way. Cardross was a man of calm judgment, so it was perhaps unlikely that he would suspect his cousin of having formed a warmer attachment for Nell than was seemly. At the same time, there was no predicting what crack-brained notion a man deeply in love might take into his head, and Mr. Hethersett was uneasily aware that by assuming the role of Nell's cicisbeo-in-chief, he had certainly laid himself open to attack. nor had he the smallest desire to contribute towards Dysart's relief. Mr. Heatherset, a gentleman of the first respectability, and a high stickler in all matters of taste and conduct, disapproved unequivocally of such dashing blades as Dysart. Such feats as jumping one's horse over a loaded dinner-table awoke no admiration in his breast, for anything that set people in an uproar was bad ton, and to be in bad ton was to be beyond pardon. The world of fashion might embrace all manner of men, the out-and-outers, the tulips, the dashies, tippies, and bloods, but the first style of elegance could only be achieved by those whose dress and deportment were characterized by an exquisite moderation. Dysart was never moderate. In the saddle he was a hard goer. On the road his ambition was to give the go-by to every other vehicle. In the gaming-room, not content, like Mr. Heatherset, to sport a little blunt on the table, he played deep. He engaged in hare-brained pranks, and the chances were that if you met him any time after noon, you would find him ripe already. None but the very straight-laced objected, of course, to a man's becoming foxed during the course of a convivial evening, but either Dysart had an uncommonly weak head, or he was carrying his drinking propensity beyond the line of what was acceptable. As for his debts, he had been monstrously in the wind at the time of his sister's marriage, and he had had ample time, since being relieved by Cardross of his more pressing obligations, to run himself to a standstill again. It would be typical of him, Mr. Heatherset considered, to apply to his sister for succour, and ridiculous to suppose that she could bring herself to deny him. He did not blame her in the least, but he was strongly of the opinion that such reckless generosity ought to be checked before it had run to such lengths as must put her, as well as Dysart, heavily in debt. A hazy recollection of the appalling load of debt under which Devonshire's mother had died flitted through his mind. Astronomical figures had been whispered, probably false, for no one knew the exact truth, but it must have been a monstrous sum. It was said she had lost a huge fortune at play. Queer sort of fellow the old Duke must have been not to have known what his wife was about, thought Mr. Heatherset. Things would never get to that pitch of disaster in Cardross's household, of course. Still, they might become pretty bad before he discovered what was happening. He was rich enough to be able to stand the nonsense, but Mr. Heatherset had a very fair idea of what his feelings would be if he found Nell out in such deception. Someone, he decided, ought to drop him a hint now, before any serious mischief had been done, and while he was still so much in love with Nell that he would find it easy to excuse her folly. He was inclined for a moment to regret having promised Nell he would not betray her to Cardross, but as soon as he played with the notion of making such a disclosure to his cousin, his imagination boggled at it. Under no circumstances could he have done it. The proper person to intervene was Lady Pevensey, and had she been in town he might, he thought, have contrived to hint her on to the trouble. Only she was miles away, tied to that ramshackle husband of hers, and there was no saying, after all, that she would see the matter as she ought. She had never seemed to Mr. Heatherset to have much more wit than a pea-goose. Besides, she doted on Dysart so fondly that she might possibly think his interests of more importance than Nell's. Nell's voice, would be cheerful but decidedly nervous, intruded on these ruminations. "You are very silent," she said. "I beg pardon," he said. "I was thinking." About this?" she asked anxiously. "No," he said unblushingly. "Thinking we should take a look in at Gunter's. You'd like an ice, I dare say. Just the thing." She thanked him, but declined the treat. She would have declined the offer of a chair to carry her home too, but on this point Mr. Heatherset was firm, knowing well what was due to her consequence. To be strolling through the streets of London with only himself as escort would not do for Lady Cardross. So he beckoned to a couple of chairmen before suggesting to her that he should do so, handed her into the chair, and completed his politeness by walking beside it to Grosvenor Square, and engaging her in a commonplace conversation that gave her to understand that he had dismissed the episode in Clarges Street from his mind. Chapter 6. Rescued from the perils of Clarges Street and restored to the shelter of her own house, Nell hardly knew whether to be grateful to Mr. Hethersett for having thrust a spoke in her wheel, or resentful. When the moment had come for knocking on Mr. King's door, she had certainly been extremely reluctant to do so, and had suffered very much the same sensations as if she had been about to have a tooth drawn. But her dependence now was all on Dysart, whom she had not seen since the night of the masquerade, and who might, for anything she knew, have taken a pet at having his ingenious plot frustrated, or, which was even more likely, have forgotten all about her troubles. She and Letty were going to the opera that evening, where it was extremely improbable that she would meet him. So she wrote a letter to him, telling him how urgent her need had become, and begging him he would call in Grosvenor Square. She had hardly dispatched this missive by the hand of her footman when Letty came in. In general, when Letty went shopping, she returned laden with parcels, and eager to display to her sister-in-law a collection of expensive frivolities which had happened to catch her eye. But on this occasion she had nothing to show but a disconsolate face. She said she had had a stupid morning, but when Nell asked if she had been unable to find a muslin she liked, she replied, "Oh, yes, Martha has it. I met my cousins and went with them to Grafton House, all amongst the queasy people. Selina would have me go, because she said there were amazing bargains to be had there. I must say they had a great many muslins. I chose a checked one, but I dare say I shan't like it above half when it is made up. It cost 7 shillings the yard, too, and I don't consider that a bargain, do you?" "No, but checked muslin is always dearer than the plain colours." "I hope the Miss Thornes are quite well," Nell said politely. "Yes, at least I didn't inquire. Selina seemed pretty stout. Fanny has gone with my aunt to Mrs. Mee to arrange to have her likeness taken. They are persuaded Humby means to come to the point, and Selina says my aunt and uncle are in transports, though I can't think why they should be, for he presents a very off appearance, don't you think, besides having some odd humours." "I don't know that. I believe he is very respectable," Nell responded, wondering whether her cousin's approaching betrothal was accountable for the clouded look on Letty's vivid little face. "I collect it was Mrs. Thistleton, then, who was with Miss Selina Thorne." "Yes, and I can tell you I was soon wishing her at the deuce," said Letty, with a disgusted pout. "She is increasing, and bent on telling the whole of London. You would suppose that no one had ever before been in her situation, for she can talk of nothing else. And then what must we do but walk into Lady Eastwell? She expects to be confined next month, and nothing could be like her simperings and sighings and affectations. Sir Godfrey is aux anges over the petit paquet she means to present to him. Petit paquet, and très grand paquet, I should think, for I never saw anyone so large. I was vexed to death, dawdling along in her company and being obliged to listen to such insipid stuff. And Maria, at least, was used to be the most entertaining creature. I do hope you won't turn into a bothersome bore when you start increasing, Nell." The colour rushed up into Nell's cheeks. She said, "I hope not, indeed," but in a constricted voice, for Letty's careless words had touched her on the raw. It was some months since Lady Pevensey, tearing herself away from her stricken lord to visit her daughter, had soothed an anxiety which was even then teasing Nell. "Think nothing of it, dearest," she had said, adding with simple pride, "You are like me. You know I had been married for 3 years before Dysart was born." Nell had been comforted, and although the prospect of being obliged to wait for 3 years before she gave Cardross an heir was dismal, it was permissible to indulge the hope that she might find herself in an interesting situation considerably earlier than had Mamma. And since Cardross, neither by word nor by look, gave the least sign of disappointment, and her mind was pleasantly occupied with the manifold gaieties of fashionable life, she had not thought very much about it. But Letty's petulant remark was ill-timed. Her quite uninteresting situation now seemed to Nell of a piece with all the rest of her iniquities. She was proving herself to be in every way a deplorable wife, foolish, deceitful, spendthrift, and barren. Fortunately, since her deep blush betrayed her, Letty had picked up the latest number of the Ladies' Magazine and was contemptuously flicking over the pages and commenting disparagingly on the fashions depicted in this valuable periodical, so that Nell had time in which to recover her countenance. "Good heavens, I never saw anything so dowdy! Slate-coloured twilled sarcenet lined with white. What a figure to make of oneself! Do these new bishop sleeves hit your fancy? I don't think them pretty at all. As for this evening gown, with French braces over the bodice—" "I liked the picture of the pelisse with the round cape," Nell said, trying to infuse her voice with interest. "For my part, I think it no more than tolerable. Unless one is a regular long Meg, those capes make one appear positively squat. Hair brown merino, too, horridly drab." Letty cast the Ladies' Magazine aside, and after hesitating for a moment, said, in a voice whose carelessness was a little studied, "By the by, I shall have to cry off going with you to Somerset House tomorrow, Nell. Selina has been telling me that my aunt is hipped because I have not been to visit her quite lately, and is saying that she had not thought I could show such a want of affection, or have my head turned so utterly that I don't any longer care to be with her. You know how it is with her. She is cast into raptures or down in a minute. So, if you do not very particularly wish to look at pictures tomorrow, I dare say there will be a dead bore, too. I think I should go to my aunt's and make her comfortable again." Nell agreed to it, though she might, had she been less preoccupied, have wondered at Letty's sudden concern for Mrs. Thorne's comfort. That Mrs. Thorne might be piqued by a lack of proper observance could surprise no one who knew Letty, for without having the least ill nature or want of disposition to render attention where it was due, she had never been taught to consider the feelings of others, or to consult any convenience but her own. Having so easily won Nell's acquiescence, she took herself off to her own bedchamber, there to peruse for the 3rd time the very disturbing letter she had received from Mr. Allendale. Nell waited in vain for Dysart to put in an appearance that afternoon. Her footman brought back no answer to her note, his lordship having gone out. No, his lordship's man had not been able to say when he expected him to return. His lordship did not return to his rooms, in fact, until an advanced hour of the day, and since he was engaged to dine at Wattier's with the select company of his intimates, and afterwards to try his luck at that most exclusive of gaming clubs, it was rather too much to expect him to keep the best dinner in town waiting while he danced attendance in Grosvenor Square. A fortunate bet had, as he phrased it, brought the Dibbs into tune again, and encouraged him to think that a long run of bad luck had come to an end. With a little ready to sport on the table, there was no saying but what he might by the end of the evening be in a position to settle any number of damned dressmakers' bills, and through no more exertion than was required to cast, instead of the worst chances in the game, a few winning nicks. Inured by custom to all the stratagems known to creditors, he considered that Madame Laval's story of being about to put herself out of the way of collecting the moneys due to her was a piece of gammon. In his experience, no creditor ever put himself out of the way of collecting money. Having pursued a precarious course for some years, he was not at all alarmed by duns, and thought that Nell was being more than commonly goosish. However, he was fond of her, and if she was as sick with apprehension as her letter seemed to indicate, he would not, on the following morning, grudge an hour spent in soothing her alarms. Moreover, the morning might find him out of ebb water, and hosed and shod again, for it was nothing for a man enjoying a run of luck to win 3,000 or 4,000 pounds in one night's sitting at the Great Go. It might have been thought that a club where the minimum stake was double the sum fixed at any other gaming establishment, and the play was known to be tremendous, was scarcely the place for a young blood living on an inadequate allowance and a grossly encumbered expectation. The Viscount's well-wishers shook their heads over it, but they could scarcely blame him for playing there, since he had become a member of the club under the auspices of his own father. In general an indifferent parent, Lord Pevensey every now and then awoke to a sense of his responsibilities. Finding that his heir, after an adventurous period at Oxford, had established himself in London and was about to make his debut in fashionable circles, he had felt that it behoved him to do what lay within his power to launch him into society. He introduced him to Whites and to Wattiers, franked him into the subscription room at Tattersall's, pointed out to him certain individuals whose business in life it was to diddle the dupes, recommended him to let none but Weston make his coats, advised him to purchase his hats at Baxter's and to have his boots made by Hobey, and warned him of the dangers of offering a carte blanche to too high-flying an incognita. He was obliging enough to instruct his son in some of the signs by which he might recognize amongst the muslin company those prime articles who might be depended on to ease a protector of all his available blunt, and to counsel him strongly not to visit any but the highest-class academies. After that, and feeling he had left nothing undone to ensure for the Viscount a prosperous career, he cast off his parental responsibilities, which had by that time begun to bore him very much, and left his son to his own devices. Wattiers, which was situated on the corner of Bolton Street and Piccadilly, in an unpretentious house which had once been a gaming establishment of quite a different order, was generally supposed to owe its existence to the Prince Regent. Wattier had been one of his cooks, but the Prince, upon learning from some of his friends that a good dinner was not to be had at any of the London clubs, had conceived the benevolent notion of providing gentlemen of high ton with a dining-club not just in the common style, and had suggested to Wattier that he was the very man to carry out this pleasing design. The idea took. In partnership with 2 other of the royal servants, Mr. Wattier embarked on the venture, and prospered so well that within a very few years he was able to retire from active participation in the business of running the club. By that time, what had begun as a dining club with excellent cooking, carefully chosen wines, and harmonic assemblies as its attractions, had blossomed into the most exclusive as well as the most ruinous of all London's gaming clubs. The dinners, under the surveillance of Mr. Augustus Labourie, continued to be the best that could be had in town. It had a bank of £10,000. Mr. Brummel was its perpetual president, and to be admitted to membership was the object of every aspirant to fashion. Play began at 9 o'clock and continued all night, the principal games being hazard and Macao, a form of 20 introduced into England by the émigrés from France, and still enjoying a considerable vogue. The Viscount, after an evening devoted to faro, had not found that this alteration in his habits answered as well as he had hoped it might, and when he rose from a very convivial dinner, he resisted all attempts to lure him into the Macquart room. He would give the bones another chance, he said, for he had a strong presentiment that fortune was at last about to favour him. So, indeed, it seemed. Being set £20, and naming 7 as the main, he threw 11, nicking it, which promised well for the night's session. Even Mr. Fancourt, who had been trying to lose money to him for months, and had begun to despair of achieving his ambition, felt hopeful. From the circumstance of the Prince Regent's holding one of his bachelor parties at Carlton House that evening, the club was rather thin of company. Mr. Hethersett, strolling in at midnight, found the Macquart room deserted by all but a collection of persons who figured in his estimation either as prosy old stagers or tippies on the strut. He took a look in at those intent on hazard, but there again the company failed to attract him, and he was just about to leave the premises when he was suddenly smitten by an idea. It was not a very welcome idea, nor did he look forward with the least degree of pleasure to the putting of it into action, but it was the best that had occurred to him during the course of a day largely devoted to wrestling with the problem of Lady Cardross's financial difficulties. The more he considered this matter, the greater had grown his uneasiness. For the mild tendre he felt for Nell did not lead him to place any very firm trust in her promise to keep away from usurers. A just man, he was obliged to own that if she dared not confess her debts to Cardross, no other solution than to borrow upon interest suggested itself. In his opinion, she was magnifying Cardross's wrath rather absurdly. It was unlikely that he would hear the confession with complacence, but he was not only a man very much in love, he was also a man of generous temper and a good deal more than common sense. No one would be quicker to make allowance for youth and inexperience, and although there could be little doubt that he had forbidden Nell to keep her brother in funds, Mr. Hethersett had still less doubt that he would understand, even sympathize with, the very natural feelings which had led her to disobey him. He would know how to put a stop to such practices too, and that was something that ought to be done immediately if Nell was not to founder at the last in a morass of debt and deception. Cardross would pardon her now with no loss of tenderness, but if he discovered in the future that she had been playing an undergame with him, perhaps for years, the very openness of his disposition would cause him to regard her with revulsion. Mr. Hethersett, gloomily pondering, had reached the conclusion that although it would be of some advantage if his cousin were to be put in possession of the facts by almost any agency, the only happy outcome to the affair would be for Nell herself to make the disclosure. But when he had urged her to do so, she had recoiled from the suggestion, and had begged him in considerable agitation not to betray her to Cardross. The suspicion had crossed his mind that all might not be so well with that marriage as appeared on the surface. Thinking it over, it occurred to him that the couple were not as often in company together as might have been expected. It was not, of course, in good ton for a man to live in his wife's pocket, but the cynicism which had prompted the higher ranks of the previous generation to regard marriage as a means of advancement or convenience was going out of fashion. Amongst his father's contemporaries, Mr. Hethersett knew of more than one man who could never be sure how many of his lady's offspring had been fathered by himself, while the number of middle-aged couples of the first stair who never willingly spent as much as half an hour together was past counting. But that sort of thing was going out of fashion. Love matches were being indulged in by persons of consequence, and public signs of affection, instead of being thought intolerably bourgeois, were even smiled on. Mr. Hethersett, whose fastidiousness had lately been offended by the sight of a newly married pair seated side by side on a small sofa with their heads together at an evening party, was inclined to think that the pendulum was swinging too far, and certainly he did not expect Cardross to behave with such a want of breeding. At the same time, he did sometimes wonder that Nell, Married to a man who had not only chosen her for love from amongst a dozen more eligible ladies, but was also possessed of a charm which made him generally fascinating to females, should so frequently appear in public either unescorted or with some quite inferior gallant at her side. There was nothing to take exception to in that, of course, and never anything in her manner towards her admirers to encourage the most inveterate seekers after crim cons to suspect her of having fallen to guilty attachment. Mr. Hethersett was pretty well persuaded that she had no eyes for any man but Cardross.